Estamos ao vivo, Rafaela.
Perfect. So, hi everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. For those of you that are joining us now, this is the third panel of the large event of the first international book published by Women in Antitrust. The event is also organized by VIA. Oh, perfect. The event is organized by WIA and Ascola and also counts on the support of Mackenzie. So as both director of WIA National Book and one of the coordinators of WIA International Book, I feel very honored to be the moderator of this panel. Our panel will discuss one of the hot topics of modern antitrust, mergers involving digital platforms, which is a very important subject for both practitioners, competition authorities, and economic players around the world. So today we will tackle some relevant merger cases involving key players in the digital field, particularly in Mexico, Chile, and in Brazil. So it is very interesting to see how different jurisdictions are developing their approach of enforcement over digital platforms. So currently we have jurisdictions at different stages of intervention and taking different regulatory approaches. So we hope that our panel could contribute to this ever-evolving debate. So moving on to a quick presentation of our panelists, we have here with us today to discuss her paper at the WIA First International Book, Elisa Mariscal. Elisa, thank you so much for joining us. Elisa is a managing director of games economics and head of Mexico City's office. She has worked in competition matters for more than 20 years, both as regulator in previous competition authorities for 7 years, in which she held several relevant positions, and also worked as an economic consultant and expert in various consulting firms in the US and in Mexico. And also in the academic sphere, she's an economics and law professor at CG and also president of CPI. She holds a PhD and a master in economics from the UCLA and a licenciatura in economics with honors from ITAM. And she has been listed in Who's Legal as a consulting expert economics since 2018. So thank you so much for joining us, Elisa. Unfortunately, today, Lenisa Prado, former commissioner of CAGI, will not be able to join us, but we will definitely consider her contributions to the book. Today, Lenisa, she authored a paper in our book called The Definition of Abuse of Dominant Position in Digital Markets, Challenges and Institutional Perspectives. And among other things, the paper discusses the analysis carried out by CAGI in the merger involving Activision Blizzard and Microsoft. So we have some relevant discussion surrounding this topic. And just moving forward to the presentation of our Brazilian speakers, we have here also with us today Silvia Faga, which is currently director of LCA, vice president of IBRAC, and vice president of WIA. She holds a PhD in economics from FGV, and she was a visiting researcher at Columbia University. And currently, Silvia teaches at FGV and INSPER some relevant courses, also tackling a lot digital markets and antitrust. Thank you all. It's very, I feel very honored to have both of you, such an amazing economists, for our panel today. And we have also here with us Marcos Barros, which is a lawyer and associate professor at Law School of Mackenzie. And he's the coordinator of the Law and Regulation Society. His research agenda explores the sociological aspects of economic regulation and competition law. So thank you all for joining our panel. And moving to Elisa, we want to hear about your paper, which is Walmart Cornershop, Uber Cornershop, a case study on learning about regulatory biases, blind spots, and the need for transparency in merger analysis. Elisa, thank you so much for joining us. You have the floor now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this really important, I think, and useful venue of writing papers commonly for the whole region, and also obviously for this presentation. And this paper is co-authored with my business partner, Alexander Elbittar, who is also a PhD in economics from the University of Pittsburgh and who's a professor at CIDE in Mexico. But this was, and I have to start with a disclosure. This was a paper that originated from the fact that we participated as economists in the merger, and we tried, and it was a very interesting experience. There was a lot of learning also, and it was very interesting that it was occurring simultaneously in two jurisdictions at the same time. We had Chile reviewing this at the same time as Mexico was reviewing this, and it was really striking how different each agency was viewing the merger. Obviously, this has to do with structural conditions in each market and with the agency's experience in looking at these companies over time. But we thought that it was very interesting to try to link this also with a discussion that was happening in competition on biases, particularly consumer biases in the digital market, about all these blind spots that consumers have, about how there's herding behavior, about how consumers are sometimes not reliable in taking information and acting upon it. And we thought that we would try and use all this theory that had been built around consumers and try to apply it to regulators as well. Because we thought that there were some really interesting biases arising from the way that each one of these regulators was looking at the analysis. So what I'm going to try and do is, I have a very old presentation that we did. Let me see if I can share this. I'm going to try and share my PowerPoint. I'm very bad at this because not this, because I'm using my iPad, so I'm sorry. It'll be a little strange. So I'm just going to try and share my PowerPoint presentation. I hope you can see it, just because the market is a little different. So if people have trouble seeing the presentation, just let me know. But this is how the Walmart Cornershop merger was looked at. There were a bunch of, it's a complicated market because it's not only a digital market or a platform market, but it was the joining of a brick and mortar business with a digital market. And I think that we're going to be seeing more of these, and it's not as strict as just looking at digital markets. So so this is sort of a general overview of who the companies are. So in Cornershop, so in Mexico, you have the brick and mortar stores, Costco Wholesale, Walmart. You have other companies like H-E-B coming from the US. And then you have convenience stores. For example, Oxxo, which is now a very large chain of convenience stores. It has almost 20,000 stores. And then you have the shoppers, which were the people on one side of the market that Cornershop would hire to go and do supermarket for people. And then these shoppers would take orders from the end users who would use different devices and send the products to themselves. And one of the key differences between Cornershop and, for example, the actual stores like Walmart or La Comer or H-E-B or Costco was that they would do this in under 90 minutes. Whereas every other store would do it, but it might take more than 3 hours or maybe 1 or 2 days. So this was something completely different. The other thing that was striking about the analysis was that other companies, so for example, Rappi, which is a very important Colombian firm that also sells these kinds of platform services, at the time was not offering grocery shopping online. It was only doing so for restaurants. The same thing was happening with Uber Eats. So it was just if you wanted a pizza, you would go to Uber Eats or to Rappi and you would order things. Eventually, Rappi moved into the grocery sphere. And the other company that existed then was Mercadoni, which actually went under. So this was a dynamic market that was moving very differently. And so I think this is sort of the key slide that I wanted to show you, which sort of marks the difference between both the timing and the theories of harm that were analyzed by the two agencies. So the first thing is the merger is notified within, it's just a couple of weeks difference between Chile and Mexico. One is late October, the other is early November. The Chilean authority is concerned chiefly with coordinated effects, whether prices are going to be different or if there's going to be information being sent from one market to the other. And this, as we say in the paper, has chiefly to do with the example that the Fiscalía Nacional Económica has had in the supermarket sphere, where it has had cases that involve collusion. So transparency the level of transparency in the market was taken into account. And this is a fairly transparent market. Most stores have people that go to other stores to review prices. So it wasn't seen as a big concern. And although it did consider that the data that the platform owner had from all of its different sellers could be a strategic problem, it did not consider this data as an element that would be shared to other competitors. In terms of unilateral effects, again, this has to do with the structure of the market in Chile. It was not concerned with unilateral effects. In contrast, Mexico's key concern was unilateral effects. And one of the things that we argue in the paper is that this has a lot to do, one, with obviously the structure of the market, but the other has to do with the types of cases that the Mexican authority has reviewed over time. So most of the cases that the Mexican authority has reviewed over time have to do with mergers in the retail sector. And the big player in the retail sector has always been Walmart. So that instead of looking at this merger as a merger that is occurring in a different sphere, a digital market sphere between a brick and mortar, it was looking at this as a merger that was occurring in the brick and mortar sphere with a brick and mortar company simply acquiring a new channel of distribution that happened to be digital. So most of the analysis had to do with its concern of customer foreclosure. So that meant that that Walmart, for example, would not sell in other platforms with input foreclosure, which meant that there was a risk that Cornershop would not allow other players to go into its marketplace, and that this could occur partially or totally. I think that those two unilateral effects, at least the way that we argued them, we did not consider there was a high risk, because the whole point of the transaction was precisely to buy a marketplace, not simply a channel for Walmart. But I think that one of the key theories of harm that had merit and that was a concern was the use of using competitor data. So one of the key remedies that had to be offered in order for this merger to go through was to give assurances to the authority that there was going to be some sort of Chinese wall whereby Walmart could not see the information from its other competitors that Cornershop offered. And unfortunately, I think like many of these transactions, a lot of it has to do with the process, the timing, and the availability and possibility of communication at certain key moments in the merger. And this did not occur, so that the merger was blocked. It was officially blocked by the end of September, but it was mainly blocked by the end of May. And what is particularly interesting, when there are a couple of things that are interesting. One is that this involved a market that, in terms of Walmart sales, which was the key concern, it was only 1.4% of Walmart sales that were at stake. And Cornershop was found to have substantial market power of this 1.4% of Walmart sales. And this is in stark contrast with the way that the Fiscalía Nacional Económica in Chile saw it, since it looked at this market as a market that was growing, that was dynamic, that anyone could go into this market. The Mexican authority saw this market as fixed, and then Cornershop had about 40% of a 1.4% sized market online. So this was one of the key issues. Let me just, I'm trying to figure out how to stop the sharing. Sorry, stop sharing, there we go. So this was one of the key issues that the authority looked at. Now, one of the things that we found interesting that the authority did not consider in Mexico was, at the time that the merger was announced in Mexico, it involved the purchase of 100% of the shares of Cornershop by Walmart for $250 million. That was the size of the transaction. And by June, when the transaction was barred by COFECE, Uber announced its intention to buy Cornershop, only 51% of Cornershop, for $500 million. So this meant that over the course of 6 months, the price of Cornershop had quadrupled somehow. This is sort of very indicative of the kind of conversation that we usually have with other antitrust authorities about what a killer acquisition means and what killer acquisition types of characteristics can indicate about problematic mergers. It's interesting that it was barred by Mexico. It took more than 6 months for it to be barred, whereas the Chilean authority found no problem with it within 3 months. And the Uber story is completely different. In the case of the Uber Cornershop transaction, the Mexican authority authorized this in less than 3 months. Its resolution is 4 pages long. And the Chilean authority took more than 6 months, went in depth into the analysis, was particularly concerned about what it referred to as reverse killer acquisition, that this sort of acquisition meant that Uber would no longer grow a business, for grocery delivery and would be buying a business that was already there. And at least in Mexico, after this, so this happened in 2019, I think that Cornershop basically no longer exists in Mexico. It exists within Uber Eats, and I think there's a lot to be said about the reverse killer acquisition in practice. It would be very interesting to have a sunset review of what this meant. But I think that one of the key issues that we took from this is that it's important to look at biases on the part of the regulators. So we thought of like switching the way that we talk about biases in digital markets for consumers, and to also include those biases in terms of regulators. So there are a bunch of biases that we usually talk about. We talk about groupthink, so or herding behavior. So if Europe is doing this, if the US is doing this, if Brazil is doing this, if everyone is doing this, then this ought to be the way to do it. About confirmation bias. So if at the beginning we think that Walmart is large, then whatever Walmart buys, it doesn't matter what it is, it should not buy it. There's a rush to consensus, so or a framing effect. If information is presented in a certain way, then immediately that way becomes a fact. And I think that for us, what was interesting in writing this paper was to write a paper that talked about the awareness that regulators should have of their blind spots, because I think that this case, regardless of whether there are merits or not for having approved the merger, it does present some interesting cases on looking at blind spots, especially because of the stark difference between Mexico and Chile's analysis. So Chile's analysis was much more dynamic. It considered the market as not being mature. It was forward-looking. It was looking at the ease of entry for other potential competitors. And I think that one of the takeaways for this is that, especially for digital markets, more transparency and communication between the parties in a merger would have been extremely useful. And I'll leave it at that. I think I took up my 20 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. So relevant. It's actually very, very interesting for us to start looking at the regulators' blind spots. Now shifting to our Brazilian speakers, I wanted to call Sylvia to comment a little bit on the papers. Sylvia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Rafaela. And thank you, Professor Juliana Domingues, Professor Vicente Bagnoli, we as Ascola and McKinsey for putting this event together. Of course, it is an honor for me to be here with you all, and it was really an honor. And I was really happy to have access and in between commas, be forced to read Elisa's paper, because I didn't have a chance before, and then prepared this panel. I had such a good surprise in reading, such a good analysis, and the comparisons that were made, and the blind spots that you highlighted were so. It was a blind spot for me. For instance, I would never think about coordinated effects in this kind of market, and there may be some possibilities in which coordinated effects can happen, as you explained. In the paper, gives this idea. When you're thinking about digital markets, I would never think that coordinated effects could arise unless we're talking about algorithm coordinating prices or trying to have airline prices, flight prices in this kind of circumstances. But it wasn't so clear for me how coordinated effects could be a concern in a merger case involving retail market, because usually when you're talking about coordinated effects, you assume that you have commodities, that you have, and that is easy for you to access pricing to compare prices. Okay, in retail, in theory, you may have access to different prices, but it's not so easy to compare the whole prices and to align the prices. And at the same time, it may be easy for companies to betray the price agreed. But I do understand that there is this coordinated effect that that is a tacit one. It's not a cartel. It is this facility, this to be easy for the companies to have the information of the market and then align their strategy. I still believe that in a market like Brazil, it would be hard for it to see this alignment, but there's a possibility of happening in other countries. Brazil do have a lot of retailers, big ones, small ones, who have a lot of marketplaces, and so I think it'd be hard. But I do understand that from the perspective that you brought in your paper, this may happen in smaller places, in smaller countries as well. And I also have some notes here. So, but one thing that I think it was really interesting in your paper. So, if you could bring us more ideas or bring more about your thoughts on coordinated effects in merger cases, I think it would be useful if you had the chance to investigate that to the paper or related to other cases. But one thing that was also interesting is the fact that you highlighted that local conditions, the competition dynamic of each country may impact a lot the antitrust enforcement outcome. And this is something that you've been discussing not only when you're discussing the specific merger cases, but also in general to discuss regulation and competition policy as a more broader government policy, public policy, because as you know, all the countries somehow is discussing how to regulate platforms. And in Europe, we already have the DMA. People are using the DMA as a reference in many countries, even in Brazil. And then when you look to other countries, we do not have the same kind of regulation being enforced or even being discussed. So we do have a lot of different options to import to a country, but it's always very important to take into account that the country characteristics and the country features are very important to implement any kind of public policy and to affect the outcome. And I think discussing a specific case and comparing Mexico with Chile, you can have this idea very clearly. So I think it is helpful in this way as well. So that, and I'm very biased about the regulation issue because we've been discussing this a lot in Brazil. So this is why I made this connection with your paper, with a broader discussion about regulation. Just a second. Oh, okay. And one last comment because I want to leave to leave more time for you to comment and also for Professor Marco to discuss as well. I think another topic that you brought, I don't know about your experience in developing economic opinions, especially regarding efficiencies, but in Brazil, in a consultant company, and we do a lot of economic opinions about efficiencies in merger cases. And even in traditional markets, it's very hard for us to have the high standards of the authority being met. And I do understand that the standards need to be high. But at the same time, when you're discussing, especially when you're discussing digital markets, usually the concerns are related to efficiencies that the merger is going to bring. Like usually they're related to economy of scale, net effect. All of those make the new platform or the new company, because you're not merging only platforms, but the new company more efficient. And because they got more efficient, they are increasing their restriction. and then make it harder even for the rivals that are already in the market to compete with this new company that's going to be formed after the deal. So when you are recognizing that you have some concerns, you are implicitly recognizing that this deal is bringing or is making it possible to have synergies, because you have economies of scale, because you have scope, and because you have net effects. And at the same time, it will be even more difficult for you to prove to the authorities that you have synergies. So it seems like the standards for you to meet to convince the authority that the harm can be caused is different from the standards you need to meet to show the authority that there may be synergies. I'm not discussing that maybe the synergies that you have in the deal is not high enough, or they do not compensate the possible harm that you're calling to the market and to the competition environment. And I do know that it's very hard for you to have the net effect in these cases, because it's not okay. I have such a high efficiency that I can afford to have some uncompetitive effect in the market. I know this is not how the authorities tend to think, but at the same time, they disregard completely the efficiencies, even though they recognize that you have economies of scope, economies of scale, and net effect increasing the barriers to entry in the market. So how can they disregard completely efficiencies when they recognize that the same efficiencies may harm competition? So this is something that I also connect with the kind of work I tend to do here in Brazil. And I do believe that this is the kind of, let's say, compatibility that you face in other jurisdictions as well. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that as well. So those are my main comments. Of course, I'll have some comments on Lenisa's paper as well, but I would like to hear you both, Professor Marco and Elisa, and then you can discuss a little further. Thank you. And congratulations again. I think your paper is really, really good.
So Marco,
Thank you.
I don't know. Do you want to go first? Or maybe Professor Elisa?
I'm fine.
I don't know.
If Marco goes first.
Okay.
I mean, whatever is better.
Okay. So Marco.
Okay. So for me, it's an immense honor to be in this panel. I'm a really big fan of women in antitrust work, and also I want to congratulate the group with this fantastic book. Not only Elisa paper, but the whole contributions are very, very important. For me, it was a pleasure. I would also like to thank the invitation of Professor Vicente Bagnoli and also Professor Juliana Domingues to engage on this discussion. Just there is an issue here regarding McKinsey students. Professor Bagnoli asked me to share the QR code for the registration on the panel. So I will just share the image of the QR code in order to everyone register. Let me just see if I can find. Okay. So my comments will address 2 points on Elisa's paper. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Elisa for the fantastic work. For me, it was a pleasure reading this paper. And it will be one general comment and one more specific. Regarding the general comment, I think that the paper addresses classical discussions regarding the challenges of merge reviews in digital platforms. So the first challenge is try to understand the dynamics and the variety of these markets, especially regarding the different business models that usually this market operates. So this is not an easy task for the authorities in order to understand the different business models. Usually we can classify on three business models: subscription models, where usually they serve providers and a user who pays the subscription to access the service. The other example is the advertising model, where the service usually usually do not involve a payment for the user, but the platform indirectly earn through advertisements. And I think this is an interesting case here, because I think, as mentioned on the paper, the Mexico authority and also the Chile authority, they did not consider the effects of the transaction in the market for advertising. This is perhaps something interesting or not to discuss, and I would like to hear more on thoughts about that regarding that. Wouldn't this be also a bias of the case? Another classical problem, is the consideration of innovation. So we usually know that the platforms, they produce disruptive innovations, so they create new markets, and usually this represents, a big breakthrough that sometimes brings unseen changes, and also it takes long to operate the effects. And this opens for another debate, another question about the time frame of the assessment of the effects of the transaction. I think perhaps this is an important question when we try to compare the benefits and also the limitation of ex ante and ex post controls of merger review. A third classical problem of the digital markets are the use of personal data. So this is not new, but everyone knows that platforms usually use and refine the user data, and they use this as an essential input in order to create a dynamic scale economy. So as companies operate with more data, they usually offer products at a lower cost, and so this could also represent a potential barrier to entry. I think Elisa's work also debates on this perspective. Another problem, as mentioned by Silvia, is the network effects, and usually this is also a problem that it's a problem that usually provide platforms, they have problems in order to understand the impact of the facts, right? And so in this sense, my first consideration, I think that the paper addresses all the classical problems regarding the digital markets and also the impact of this in the merge review. My comments are usually regarding the relation of sociology and economy. So my second consideration of the paper is regarding, the important achievements underlying these, let's say, dogmatic and practical issues of antitrust law. So one point is the importance of comparative studies in antitrust. I believe that this paper explores the comparison between two important Latin American countries, and also the process of constructing a tailored merger review that not usually go just simply adapting the European or the North American model. So I believe, this is very important, this kind of work, in order to understand the specificities of each scenario. And usually there's a big lack of studies like promoting comparisons between Latin American countries. You usually see more work towards the comparison with Latin American countries and Europe or in North America. So this, I think, is an important achievement of the paper. And another point is that I believe that the paper has two levels of analysis that is carried out very carefully. The first level is the comparison of the cases itself and the different outcomes that these merger review cases produced. So the main argument of the paper is that the market dynamics in Mexico and Chile are different, and of course this impacts each jurisdiction. And for me, regarding my perspective from sociology, there is an important discussion underlying this argument, that is the path dependence and the incremental learning process that each authority deals in order to assess the transactions. A possible suggestion, and this is my reading of the paper, is to consider, for instance, the political scientist work of Charles Sabel trying to apply the concept of learning process that can be understood in the paper as the process on how the antitrust authorities they are trying to adapt and evolve in a response to the changing environments. One important argument of Seido's work is that usually institutions can improve their effectiveness through a continuous process of learning and adaptation, which usually involves experimenting new approaches and also monitoring the outcomes. So my first question for Elisa is, do you think it's the case to apply the idea of institutional learning in the process of constructing new guidelines regarding merge review of digital markets? Do you understand this as an important factor in your analysis? This is very interesting because you highlight in a lot of aspects in the paper, the different outcomes regarding the trajectory of each antitrust authority. So you mentioned that in the Mexican case, there is more concern regarding a consolidated market. Vis-a-vis in the Chilean case, there is a more balanced approach regarding also with the importance of the anti-competitive behaviors involved in the analysis. So this is something that I was thinking while I was reading your paper. And the other argument of my analysis is, perhaps the really interesting hypothesis of the regulatory blind spots. So this is very interesting because you debate on how the cognitive bias can also affect regulators, not only consumers. And this, it's a situation where we have to understand that sometimes regulators have a lack of awareness of new technologies, of practices, and we can understand this in bias such as the problem of framing, of group decision making, and also the confirmation bias that you mentioned in your presentation. And again, I believe that also this discussion opens for the idea of institutional learning. So I would like also to ask you if it wouldn't be the case of discussing new institutional designs or new modifications, not only on, let's say, the dogmatics of the antitrust, but also in the structure of the commissions regarding, the necessity of transformation in order to avoid or to mitigate this bias. For instance, consider now the stability or the changes of the commission, if this impacts the time period of analysis, or for instance, perhaps commissions that are more open for transparency. It seems that one of the conclusions of your paper is the importance of taking more seriousness the institutional learning process in the antitrust authorities, and perhaps this is a challenge nowadays because perhaps there are more antitrust authorities that are more open for transformation, inside transformation, and others that are not. So again, thank you so much for the work. For me, it was a pleasure. And also, again, my concerns are from a sociological perspective. I'm not an economist. And for me, this was a very interesting paper, since I also work with different regulatory dynamics. And I also agree with you that today, one of the most important concerns are the regulatory blind spots. And in order to overcome this problem, we usually have to think on new design mechanisms besides the transformation of the dogmatics. Thank you so much, Rafaela.
Thank you, Marco. Very, very interesting to see how you dealt with such an interdisciplinary approach, tackling sociology, behavioral economics, and also competition law. So now I'll leave the floor for Elisa to comment.
Well, first of all, I'd really like to thank you for your comments. I think they're incredibly enriching and thought-provoking. So, and that you took the time to read the paper carefully. I have a page of notes of all your comments, which I do want to address because I find them so interesting that we're having this conversation. So I'll start saying one thing. So one thing, Marco, that I'll say is, so yes, I'm a doctor in economics, but as you know, in the US, when you do a PhD in economics, you have to choose two fields. So one of my fields was industrial organization. The other one was economic history, specifically institutional design. So this is probably why I think some of the issues that you raise are particularly interesting for me. So I thank you for posing them. And then I'll go back to Sylvia. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You talked a lot about coordinated effects, and I found it interesting because, and in the space of mergers, because for a very long time, Mexican law said that we stated specifically that mergers only needed to be reviewed in terms of their unilateral effects. And then it had another paragraph that said, and other things. And there was a big discussion for very many years until we finally agreed that the other things meant coordinated effects. That if everyone else was doing coordinated effects, we couldn't just do unilateral effects. But I think the lawyers were particularly risk averse to opening the door to coordinated effects. But I think it's very relevant. And I think in digital markets, even though initially it seemed irrelevant, now that we have all this discussion about algorithmic competition and how algorithms can agree on prices without agency, apparently, just magically agree on prices, I think that coordinated effects in digital markets becomes very, very interesting. You did talk about innovation, and I think that one of the things that has been a key concern of mine in Latin America is specifically in mergers is we have a growing concern on how all of these digital markets can create large gatekeepers, how these gatekeepers can foreclose, etc. But I understand that discussion very well for mature agencies, but for countries like ours, where innovation is scarce sometimes, I think we need to weigh the innovation component much more than the foreclosure component. And it doesn't mean that we ignore it, but we can't ignore the innovation component. And here's where efficiencies become particularly important. We also have very high standards in efficiencies, and it's very frustrating for economists because even though we break our heads trying to provide arguments for the authorities on how there are synergies and how there are efficiencies, the authorities don't tend to consider efficiencies. And I'm guessing in Brazil and in the rest of Latin America, we all follow like the ICN guidelines that efficiencies have to be merger specific, no other way to obtain them, and that they have to be measurable. And even though I think we try and show that, it's still very much up to the regulator whether they want to take that into account or not. But I think that what's very telling and what we found like very shocking in this case is that the Walmart Cornershop case is basically a vertical merger. So Walmart is in the brick and mortar, and they're just buying an outlet in the digital sphere so that they can send their goods there. And I think that one key efficiency for consumers was that they're solving a last mile problem for the consumer. So usually in retail markets, consumers are the ones that move to the supermarket store. So the last mile gets solved by the consumer. And the corner shops or Uber Eats of these worlds actually solve it the other way around. They bring it to your house. You don't have to move a finger. So there are some gains there that are very interesting in terms of business logic. But now if you look at the new US guidelines or even the discussion in Europe, it's all about no longer about markets, but ecosystems. So that means that the ecosystem for Walmart is moving into something bigger. Whether I think that brick and mortars can pose the same risk in terms of ecosystems as, I don't know, the Amazons or the Metas or the Googles of this world is different. But I think, again, this is where I think the regulatory biases play. No, they're listening to what's happening somewhere else and trying to put it into markets that not necessarily represent the same degree of risks. Whereas the Uber Cornershop merger was a horizontal merger. This was the same business, and I think one of the reasons that it was passed so quickly in Mexico is because what Cornershop really needed in the end was funding, and it was not getting funding, and it had been deprived of funding for over a year. So this was basically a failing firm defense by the time we got to the Uber Cornershop. I mean, obviously, that's not going to be in any of the documents. Again, that's part of the transparency problem. But this is what you look at, and it's difficult. The other thing that I think made it particularly, and we have a short discussion of this in the paper, is that the Uber Cornershop merger also involved the telecommunications regulator, because there is this discussion on whether if it's just platforms, then it ought to go to the telecommunications regulator, who also holds competition powers. Whereas Walmart and Cornershop involved a brick and mortar business, so that meant it went to the competition authority. So we still haven't solved that gift that came with the reform in 2013, and that's going to be a problem for Mexico in particular. Then I want to go to some of the things that Marco mentioned in his comments. So you mentioned several things about challenges for merger reviews, and one of the things you talked about was the difficulty of understanding the business model. I think it goes both ways. It's a very difficult way of understanding a business model for a regulator, but also the parties have a very hard time of explaining their business model in regulatory terms. I think they're good at pitching a business model to get venture capital, but not to provide a regulator an understanding of what's happening with that. And I think that creates a big problem. In this case, I think that advertising, which you mentioned as one of the business models, was not discussed, was because that could get you into the very complicated portion of having the telecommunications regulator involved. So again, this makes the analysis incomplete because we have a problem in how our laws are written. But it's true, it should have been. The other thing that I think, again, this is when you just import arguments from other authorities without, we call it in Mexico, tropicalizing them. So they need to be tropicalized. We're not Europe and we're not the US. So when you just import these things, something like data, so how is data going to be used? They just imported that. That is a concern. But there are papers now. I think Julian Wright has a paper, and I have a paper written with Alexander Elbittar also about the value of data. So it's not just that data will be used, but how valuable that data is. So the marginal value of additional data is what makes a difference, not the fact that a company has data. Whether getting additional data will make a difference, that should have been the focus of the analysis. Because nowadays, every single company ought to have data. That's part of how the world works. So data cannot be used as an excuse for a barrier or for a competition problem. And I don't think that was done. In terms of institutional learning, I couldn't agree more. But the problem, I think, there is transparency and whether agencies are willing to be vulnerable to that transparency, to that institutional learning. And I think that in particular, and I'll speak to the Mexican experience, which is what I know, Mexico, the moment that it barred that merger, it started advertising all over the world that it was going to have teeth when it came to digital markets. So that was its poster child of we will be tough in digital markets. And in the end, what happened was it allowed a killer acquisition. I think it will be the last person in the room to say that that's what happened, but that in fact that's what happened. So I think that institutional learning makes it very difficult when you have politics involved in this, and it does happen. And the only way that institutional learning can really occur is if you involve the judicial sector. If you then go towards, in Mexico, we have the figure of an amparo. So if you go and to the judiciary, to the specialized tribunals, and ask for a review of this, but very rarely does this happen in mergers. I mean, mergers are dumb things. Even if you win nothing but the satisfaction of saying you're wrong, but the merger has gone through. So I think that this is something that we need to think of in terms of how we're going to make it work in the future. And those would be my comments.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Before opening for questions from the audience, just wanted to check if Sylvia or Marco have any additional comments.
Not for now, at least. I think you could have some comments from the audience.
Okay, so let's see if we have any questions from the audience. I think for now we don't have any questions, but I have a question for Elisa. A more broad question, actually. We are hearing about Mexico all over the place, right? In the international scenario, the Mexican competition authorities are definitely under the spotlight. And well, in recent years, the Mexican antitrust authorities had actually some significant experiences involving the analysis of digital mergers, like the ones you mentioned in your paper, Uber, Cornershop, and Walmart Cornershop. And more recently, we have the investigating authority in Mexico releasing a preliminary report on retail e-commerce, suggesting some structural remedies for Amazon and Mercado Libre. And given such relevant developments, in your view, Elisa, what do you think that we can expect from the Mexican authorities when it comes to digital platforms? Do you envisage a more interventionist approach in digital mergers in Mexico? If you can talk a little bit about it.
Yes, sure. I mean, you made me study the market investigation on Amazon and Mercado Libre. I think that one of the things that we have in Mexico that is a huge bonus that most authorities don't have is we have market investigations like the UK. I think that it's Iceland, the United Kingdom, and Mexico who really have market investigations. And I think that that is a really interesting tool. Instead of trying to do it as a conduct investigation or as a merger, it allows for a lot more flexibility. It also allows for remedies instead of fines. So I think that the fact that they're using a market investigation is a really interesting experiment with that regulatory tool. I'm not sure how successful or easy it will be to do this because these are now global markets. So I at least when I got to speak to the authority at some point, I always think that market investigations, what they require is backward induction. As economists, you need to see where do you want to get, what's your end result, and if you think you're going to get your end result, you should do the market investigation. If you think you're not going to get your end result, then it's a waste of time, because then it's just like a journalistic opinion. So for example, one of the first market investigations the authority did was in airplane slots. I think the authority was completely right. There was a problem with slots, which is the time at which planes fly out of Mexico City. We had excess demand. It needed to be solved, but the end result was that the regulator for civil aviation had to be involved, and the regulator for civil aviation did not want to be involved. So then it became like a newspaper article, no effects, even though it was right. So I don't know whether the authority has done a really good job of finding or describing 3 barriers. I don't know whether the solution for those 3 barriers, if those 3 barriers are correct, and if those 3 barriers have an effect, I don't know whether those solutions are tenable, given that both Amazon and Mercado Libre exist everywhere. I don't know if they can make these changes for Mexico only. And Mexico is not Europe, where in Europe they say, from now on, you're going to open a website and it's going to ask you to allow cookies or not. And we all benefit from that all over the world because it's Europe. I don't know if Mexico has that kind of power over the world, but it basically found 3 interesting barriers that I think are worth at least discussion on reasonableness. And this is why it's interesting that it's a rule of reason, that the parties have the right to explain why they have this and why they could be efficient. One is these loyalty programs of having Prime and that sort of thing in Amazon and in Mercado Libre. The other thing is that there's asymmetric information for sellers, so that they don't know what are the elements that make them go up or down in the search box. So I think that that's another interesting element. And the third one is about bundling, that they're bundling streaming services with their Prime services. So I think all of these things are interesting. They're worthy of discussion. My biggest concern with all of the market investigations is most competition authorities are not regulators. So even if you find this, how are you going to supervise it and enforce it? But I think that we all face this problem in Latin America.
Thank you so much, Elisa. I don't know if Sylvia or Marco have any additional comments. I have like another broad question.
Yes.
We're
Maybe
actually.
I would have a broad question. I don't know. Maybe she's not. It's so broad that maybe she is not able to comment on that. But as far as I know, Confesse, the Mexican Antitrust Authority, is one of the first ones to have a unit specifically for digital market discussions, and it's been a few years now that we have this specific unit, and I don't know if you have any personal opinion or even any kind of study that can tell us how this experience of having a specific unit focusing on digital markets is doing. So if it shows to be a good example of a regulatory design, bringing more efficiency to the analysis. I don't know, any comment that you can bring, even if it's only your personal opinion, may bring some light to the discussion of how to look to those markets, and I'm very curious about that. If you had a chance to look at this kind of discussion, I don't know if you had, so it's a very broad comment here.
I do have a strong opinion about that.
Even better, even better.
And again, I could like everyone, I could be wrong, and maybe in a year people can tell me, well, you were completely wrong. But I think that the fact that the digital markets unit is in the technical secretariat and not in the investigative authority. So in Mexico, we're split. So the technical secretariat is just the staff of the plenum of the decisory board, means that it has no real power. It's just an opinion. It's just a group of researchers who are very good, and they can provide research on digital markets, but they cannot form part of the investigation to bringing a case. So right now, the market investigation that we have for Amazon and Marketplace originated from the investigative authority, and they shouldn't have had any input from the digital markets unit because they're not in the investigative authority. So I think that really limits how helpful they can be. I think that also, I mean, since I was part of the council, the advisory council for IFT, for the telecommunications regulator, I was a big proponent when I was there that they create a chief technology officer or a chief digital officer like the Europeans have, like the UK has, the CMA. Just like other authorities have a chief economist, I think that right now an authority ought to have a chief digital officer. And I thought that IFT, the Telecommunications Institute, was in a much better position to use that digital officer much better than COFECE, because it has a bunch of other areas where it can use this person better, but it has not adopted that. And I think that it would have been a better design for COFECE to have a chief digital officer that could have incidence over both the investigative authority and the plenum, rather than have this group of really good and specialized people, but who are limited in their role of using this in investigations.
So pretty clear. Maybe they should be empowered to be more effective, but it's good to know this design in details. Thank you for sharing.
So thank you so much for joining us today. Very thoughtful, very insightful discussions. And I hope we can gather together in the next version of the international book, maybe some other time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'm the head of the McKinsey Center for Economic Freedom, and I'm responsible for closing our panels today. I'm going to share a screen to help me summarize the main ideas of our discussion. Jonathan, can you confirm if the screen is projected? Okay, today we had 5 presentations. Lenisa could not be with us today, but the main ideas, in my personal view, for each presentation is summarized in this graph. So Victoria Robertson brought the discussion of the rise of the algorithmic personalized pricing. Sarah Ellison brought a discussion of the impact of regulation on ride-hailing services. Maria José Henriques brought the discussion of broadening antitrust analysis and market intervention. Athena brought a discussion about the European Union competition law and FDI update. Elisa brought a discussion of the unique challenges in digital mergers by discussing lessons from Walmart and Cornershop merger and Uber and Cornershop mergers. And finally, that could not be with us today, Lenisa would discuss reevaluating competition law in digital markets. I'm saying, first of all, that I'm very thankful to be here today. It's an honor to be part of this discussion and the launch of the Woman in Antitrust book. And I say that all the papers that have been present today are very related to contemporary issues on antitrust. Each of them gives some particular view with a case study from Chile, from Mexico, or discussion of European Union or Brazil, or US in the case of ride-hailing services. But each of them gave a contribution to some kind of a path of analysis of the discussion of digital markets and antitrust today. I try to summarize this in this diagram. I'd say that new technologies are changing the markets and also changing the firm's strategies for competing this kind of new markets. And this brings antitrust policies, a challenge for antitrust policies. When I say new technologies brings disruption. So this is very hard to do because create new products, new services, and new markets, and disrupted with the previous knowledge and previous products and previous services and knowledge. Also, with digital sector and digital platforms, they have a market failure called network externalities. So in this kind of markets, the current demand relies upon the number of the consumers that already bought the products or the service. So the size of the market increases and the market power of the firms increases too. So this is a challenge for antitrust policies. So the dynamic of the markets brings this concentrated and monopoly power issues, and also for the firm operation, there is a discussion of the critical level of supply and the scale. This results in more concentrated markets in the digital platforms, for example. On the other hand, we have this disruption that can somehow bring new competitors to the market. So this two sides of the coin. For the markets, we have, by the new technologies, innovation, consumers' needs that are being satisfied with the new products and new service, and also new technologies brings efficiency. For the firm's strategies, there is all the discussion of using users' data, not only to supply on-demand services and products, but to create new market strategies. And with, for example, price discrimination that we discussed by the morning, so personal price discrimination, or collusion between firms that share users' data and common strategies, and also mergers and acquisitions, as we discussed today in the Walmart and Cornershop, and also the case of Uber and Cornershop. On the other hand, for the antitrust policy, we have this discussion between consumer welfare and broader goals. So the issue of personal data, sustainability, all questions that are now are taken into account when merger and acquisition or competition policy are being discussed and analyzed. What we watched today in the three panels that between or across jurisdictions, there is a lot of different approaches to deal with this digital sector and new platforms. So there is no common ground. For example, we are discussing in the last panel the digital division in the antitrust policy in Mexico. It's particular issue that are not common in other countries. For example, in Brazil, there's no specific sector to deal with the digital sector in antitrust policy. Also, in this new framework of new products and new services and strategies, there is this issue related to regulatory intervention and regulatory borders with antitrust policies. So this brings a challenge for the antitrust policies. The issue is that we have a pitfall or a dangerous path. In order to deal with the new products, new strategies, new services, and what's going on with the market power, maybe antitrust policies can somehow, instead of promoting efficiency, maybe can kill innovation and market solutions. So this is the challenge. We have to balance the antitrust policy in terms of consumer welfare and deal with these new services, new platforms, but try not to kill the innovation, the market solution, the efficiency. Because somehow in these new products and new services, the scale and the market power arises as a consequence of the disruption, and is not only necessarily bad for consumers. Maybe the efficiency gains brings new opportunities and raise consumers' welfare instead of reducing their welfare. So this framework somehow tried to summarize the discussion that we had today. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Vladimir. It's a pleasure to have your comments on our book. our book, meaning the book of all these very special authors. Well, I'm Priscila Gonçalves. I'm currently the president of the Women in Antitrust. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to participate from the beginning of this webinar because of another conflicting event. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I have been monitoring all the comments that this webinar has been getting in the social media. A lot of very nice comments, and it's very important to hear from the authors of these very interesting articles in our first book in English. Which comprises a lot of different women and some men who co-authored these articles, but from a lot of different jurisdictions. So this was our first work as an international book. We have already 6 other books published in Portuguese. And this is also the first initiative together with Ascola. And I would like to thank Ascola and especially Professors Vicente Bagnoli and Juliana Domingues, who has been made this event possible. I would like to thank all the authors for taking their time, not only to write these articles, most of them are inedit, but also to some of them were able to come here to discuss. And also we have some people revising these papers, reading these papers, and it's very important for the women in antitrust community to get feedback on these very interesting articles. Most of them I have read. I have taken a look at them this week for this event, and what I realize is that this is a very actual, a very contemporary work published last year, but dealing with all the hot topics in antitrust. So we have beyond the articles that have been presented here about cases and about digital markets, and we can see that a lot of the work that has been produced for this book is related to digital platforms, but we have very interesting and up-to-date matters, such as for example, the non-compete clauses. As everybody here might be aware, just this week, the FTC published a ban on the non-compete clauses in the US. And there has also been a lawsuit against this ban and against FTC itself. So it's a very interesting issue. And we have one article dealing, for example, with this issue. The articles talk about labor markets, which is also a very up-to-date matter. So we have a lot of discussions involving mergers, involving behavior, and involving the interaction between antitrust and regulation in several industries. So this is a very, very interesting. I would recommend that everybody take some time to read these articles because they are very up to date. So I don't want to extend myself. I'm here just to close this event. And again, I would like to thank Media Lira and Juliana Domingues, who are our academic directors currently, and who has organized this event with the publishing directors Amanda Taidi and Rafaela Jaroslavsky. So and all the people involved in putting this event together. I'm also here if you want to, I don't know if the public would like to make questions. So I'm really sorry that I wasn't been able to be here to listen to the authors themselves, but I have some time to read the articles, and it was a very interesting job that I got from my colleagues at the Women in Antitrust. So I would like to say that if someone has not had the opportunity to read this work, it's very up to date and very interesting to do so.
Priscila, I think we can close the session and the panel, yes?
Yes, I guess so. If no one else would like to has something to say. In the name of the Women in Antitrust, I'd like to thank everybody for being in this webinar. We know that everybody is very busy, so it's also important to have this audience paying attention to the work produced by all these women. And I know that your time is precious, so thank you for being here, and thank you again, Professor Vladimir, and to Mackenzie as well for helping us to organize this event. So in the name of the Women in Antitrust, I would like to thank everybody.
Yes, thank you very much, Priscila, and I would like to thank you, Jonathan Gallo, that helped us with the infrastructure of the seminar today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.